Great. So thank you for the exercise. We would really want it to be practical and interactive. And now we are going to the presentation participation of the Latin America office of the FDA. We already have on the webinar Visa Vinici, Kate Serrano, and Patricia, who will be helping us with the presentation. We have Visa, who is an expert in foreign affairs in the Latin America office of the US Food and Drug Administration, where she is responsible for the activities related with the medical programs and products in the region. She has worked for the Center for Device and Radiological Health as Assistant Director responsible for the activities related to the evaluation of pre- and post-market of orthopedic devices, as well as compliance officers working in activities of compliance post-market for medical devices. In the last 3 years, she has supported the the medical device single audit program, helping with several audits, and she has 5 years of experience with the investigator FDA and is a certified quality auditor ASQ. She has had a licensing degree in chemical science and biology, as well as biomedical engineering by the Wayne State University. Vesa, thank you for your participation. And you can start sharing your screen. Let's ask you to open the camera to help the interpreters. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for the introduction. Just want to share my screen. Okay. I believe everybody should be able to see the screen and the presentation. Thank you very much, Sandra, for the introduction again. I'm Vesa Vinici. I'm the International Relations Specialist with the FDA Latin America office. And as Sandra mentioned, here with me on the call, I'm also joined by Katie Serrano, who's the Regional Director for the Latin America office, as well as by Patty Pineda, who's the policy analyst with our office as well. Today we would like to provide an overview of the FDA's medical device regulation and also how we apply the regulation in regulating diagnostics as well as all medical devices. With that, I'll go over the presentation that we have prepared for you today, and I'll also give an opportunity at the end to Katie or Patty if they would like to add anything before we take any questions. To start things off, wanted to provide an overview of where authority comes from. And so FDA's authority to regulate medical devices comes from a series of laws that are here on the screen. And for the purpose of today's talk, I won't go too much in the details about each law, but I would like to mention that the medical devices began to be regulated with the 1976 Medical Device Amendments. And since then, there's only been made to the law. So pretty much all the requirements that have been set forth in 1976 have remained quite similar with the exception of some modifications that have been made since then. How does FDA define a medical device? FDA defines a medical device as an instrument, apparatus, machine, implant, in vitro reagent, including component, part, or accessory, which are used to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent diseases or condition, and which may affect the structure or function of the body. And they achieve this without doing a chemical reaction, because that would be considered a drug. And also to mention, although there is a lot of softwares that meet the definition of medical device because they're used to diagnose a specific disease, for example, those would be considered medical devices. However, to point out here is that the medical device definition does exclude software that function for data storage, administrative support, electronic and patient are more so to maintain the data. And to bring this, to provide a little bit more on how this definition relates to in vitro diagnostics. As I mentioned, in the definition, in vitro diagnostics tests are also included in the definition of a medical device, and therefore similar in FDA, similar regulations do apply to in vitro diagnostics. And so in vitro diagnostics tests are used for diagnosing, screening, or prevention of a particular condition or disease. And environmental screening tests, worth noting is that they are not within the authority of the FDA, and so they're not included in that definition. And some examples of in vitro diagnostics are pregnancy tests or blood glucose tests, lab tests that are used for infection diseases, routine blood tests, tests for genetic diseases or conditions. All of these are considered diagnostic tests. So in general, FDA regulates safety and effectiveness, as well as quality of the design of the manufacture of medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics or IVDs. Applying a total product life cycle approach, so in pre-market as well as after the product gets into market. Medical devices, including diagnostics, are regulated to an extent that is driven by the risk of the intended use. And so if you can imagine, tongue depressors are considered low risk and are held at a lower regulatory bar than, let's say, artificial hearts. As you can imagine, failure of those devices can cause catastrophic events, and therefore they are held at a higher regulatory bar. I mentioned intended use, and so just to provide a definition of intended use. And so when we talk about risk, we talk about in the context of intended use. And the intended use is a statement that the device manufacturer uses to describe generally the disease or condition that the device will diagnose, treat, mitigate, or cure, and specifically defines the patient population in which the product should be used, as well as this or a specimen type to be used with the device. And so FDA determine the safety and effectiveness of the device by weighing any probable benefit against probable risk. And so there needs to be more benefit than risk when we're evaluating devices. And so there is 3 levels of classification for the FDA under the FDA regulations. Class 1 devices are considered low risk. Class 2 devices are considered moderate risk, and class 3 are considered high risk. So that is the highest regulatory bar that we have within our regulations to regulate medical devices. And to mention, medical devices are regulated based on risk of their intended use. And so under the definition I just gave earlier, a single device can have multiple uses. And this depends on how the device is used. It can fall under different classification based on that risk. If I were to give you a simple example, for example, masks, masks that are used for general use by the population and maybe in a doctor's office are not as high risk as, for example, masks that are surgical masks used in a sterile environment, used to protect the surgeon during the surgery, where there's body fluids and things like that in the surgical in the sterile environment. And so as you can see, similar product can have different intended uses and therefore could fall under the different classification per FDA's regulations. Similar in diagnostics, for example, a pregnancy test it's a class 2 device, but the same detection method can be used to test for cancer. And cancer is, if it's used to test for cancer, it would be considered a class 3. So similar device, in this example, class 2 for pregnancies tests, and if they're used to diagnose for cancer, then that would be considered a class 3. So in context of IVD, the risk is based on the consequences of a false result. One example is, if we're talking about diagnosing for HIV or tuberculosis, as you can imagine, if there's a false result in this context, it can impact how the patient is treated, and therefore it would have a higher risk versus testing for calcium or pregnancy. And this is just a visual to provide different classifications. As I mentioned, class 1, class 2, class 3. As you can see in the controls column, there are general controls that I'll go in depth in more detail in the next slide. But as you can see, there's general controls that apply to all devices. As you get higher in the category of risk, that apply to class 2. And then the highest risk is class 3, where general and special controls are just not enough to regulate these devices based on risk. Some examples of class masks are ready for general use. We do consider manual surgical instruments as class 1 devices. There could also be dental instruments. There are just common instruments that are used in these settings, for example, forceps or scissors and things like that. Orthotics or braces to treat sports injuries, culture media to detect for strep, for example, or tongue depressor. These are some examples of class 1 devices. So class 1 devices do not require FDA pre-market review. So they can go in the market without doing a pre-market review initially by the FDA. However, there's still general controls that do apply to these devices. For example, they still need to be manufactured in a sanitary condition to prevent them from being adulterated. They must be labeled in a certain manner so they're not misbranded or the labeling is not misleading. The manufacturer that produce these devices need to be registered and listed with the FDA. There are quality system regulation requirements that the manufacturer need to meet, as well as reporting adverse events and recalls. Class 2 devices are, as I mentioned, moderate risk devices. This is, general controls alone are not sufficient for a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, and for which there is sufficient information to establish special controls to provide such assurance. So on top of general control devices that fall under this category, and a pre-market notification is required. And this normally comes in what we call as a 510K. It's a type of submission that comes to FDA for these type of devices. Special controls can be performance testing. So there may be questions regarding how this device is going to be performing in the market. So that could look like it could be bench testing, animal testing. For example, I have, hip and knee as an example on the slide here. We're looking at able to, withstand the weight of the patient, make sure it doesn't break once it's implanted, make sure that the product doesn't wear, fast once it's implanted in the patients. All this is being, the performance test is required. In addition to that, when it comes to implants, we're looking at the biocompatibility and making sure that the materials that these products are manufactured are biocompatible. We're looking at the packaging, the ability of the packaging to withstand transportation, make sure it's still sterile, that the product meets the sterility requirements if it's intended to be sterile, and also meets the shelf life it's intended for. Some examples of class 2 devices are blood glucose meters, balloon catheters, I already mentioned hip and knee implants, antimicrobial susceptibility test systems. And in the class 2 category, FDA determines clearance based on what we call substantial equivalence. And so what we're looking at is the product is at least as safe, as effective as something out in the market already. And so we need to, the manufacturer, the applicant should be able to provide enough information to make that comparison, to make that determination. One thing to note is substantial equivalence does not mean identical technology. But in cases where there is a feature that maybe it's not well understood, it may require clinical data at that point, but not all of the submissions require clinical information. Class 3 devices, this is a bar. Insufficient, when there's insufficient information that exists to determine that general controls or special controls are sufficient to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. These devices do require pre-market approval or a PMA in order to be legally marketed. And the determination of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness is based on valid scientific evidence. Again, that could be done through testing or clinical information through literature, registries, a clinical study. Those are typically some of the scientific evidence that we do review when we're looking at these devices. In addition to that, there is requirements for in the pre-market evaluation for quality system requirements, and FDA may do for these type of devices a pre-market inspection, but they definitely review that information during the evaluation. Some of the examples, tests for hepatitis B and C, HPV tests, continuous glucose monitoring devices, heart valve, as you can imagine, if they fail, it's really catastrophic and can cause some serious injury or adverse events to patients. And most often in this category, we do see clinical data presented. In general, as I mentioned,
General, como les he mencionado.
Hi, did somebody have a question?
Okay. No.
Okay, I'll continue. In general, in pre-market review, applicant is required to submit, as I mentioned, scientific evidence to FDA to make the determination for safety and effectiveness. FDA in the decision-making in pre-market, we always encourage the use of FDA recognized consensus standards to facilitate the pre-market review process. And the Center for Devices and Radiological Health have subject matter expertise and staff that spend a lot of time in, and devote a lot of time in development of standards for this purpose, because we see a lot of value, and they do help when there's standardized tests. It helps FDA reviewers to make the determination when reviewing those tests, but also it is, you know, we see that when we have standards tests, those particular review is much quicker, and we're able to approve or get products in the market a lot quicker and make them available to patients. So we do put a lot of emphasis in this, and a lot of work goes into this. In addition to that, CDRH is a member of the International Medical Device Regulation Forum, and we highly value the global harmonization and use of the international standards. And again, in the pre-market review, we review a lot of performance testing that can include bench, animal, and clinical. So we do see quite a bit of variety of different tests in review of different medical devices. In addition to pre-market, in regulating medical devices, which also include diagnostics, so similar regulations, or the same regulations rather, apply. And so in post-market, we have requirements for reporting to FDA by the user facility and manufacturer when a device causes or contributes to serious injury or death, the device malfunctions or fails, and this is required because the use of that device could potentially then result in serious injury or death. And so once these reports are submitted, FDA staff do assess these reports. We analyze these reports for trends, and also we determine or decide if there's any additional action needed based on the reports that we receive. There is requirements for recalls, or what we refer to as a correction of removal. So anytime the device fails or is in violation of the laws, it's already in the market, we require the manufacturer to report that to FDA to prevent any serious injury to patients, and we require that they mitigate the risks to patients based on that particular failure or violation of the law. These are typically voluntary, or they're reported voluntarily by the manufacturer, but they must be reported to FDA. And once we receive these reports, FDA conducts a health hazard evaluation. There is a lot of expertise that are put into this. There's, you know, typically a surgeon, a clinician, you know, an engineer. So there's a team that is evaluating the health hazard evaluation to determine the classification risk or the classification of the recall. And the information of the recalls are then uploaded or shared on the FDA website, so we can make the public aware and the patients aware of some of the recalls that have been submitted. In addition to that, we do follow through in the plan that the manufacturers have in order to correct that a specific issue, and also prevent that from reoccurring in the future. There's also, you know, we put a lot of importance as well in the what we call quality system requirements. And it's really a set of documents, policies, and related processes and procedures that described how the organization performed the specific tasks. And one example of a you know, requirement is quality management system for medical devices, or what we refer to 45, the 2016 version. So just to explain why FDA requires a quality management system. So these are requirements, base requirements for a medical device life cycle. So meaning we have requirements in the pre-market, but we do realize that once the product is in the market, there may be changes to the design or changing the manufacturing that could potentially affect the safety or the effectiveness of the device. And this is how we set those requirements to make sure that there's controls in place and the manufacturer take the proper steps to be able to assess those changes and ensure that the product is manufactured consistently and always meets specifications before it's released to the market. The quality system requirements are designed with flexibility to accommodate the diversity. So, you know, there is a variety of different medical devices, and so all of the manufacturers can apply and accommodate these requirements. And what's the current FDA intention that I just wanted to mention? That currently, you know, this is relates to the quality system regulation. FDA is intending to harmonize and modernize the quality system regulation for medical devices. These revisions will be made to specify or recognize ISO 13485 as to meet those requirements of the quality system regulations. And these revisions are intended to reduce the compliance and record-keeping burdens on device manufacturers by harmonizing domestic and international requirements, as well as really FDA staff, because, and I will mention this in the next slide, but we work with ISO 13485 through the MDSAP, the medical device single audit program that's based on this this standard, and FDA is a full member of that program. So we do have experience utilizing the standard. Again, quality system requirements as well as ISO 13485, you know, they are requirements for life cycle of the device. They are used globally by many regulators, such as Canada, Japan, South Korea, Europe, Australia. So we do see value in being able to globally harmonize. And this is why our intention is to move in that direction. And currently we're making you know, modifications to the regulation to recognize ISO 13485. And I already mentioned the medical device single audit program that is already based on that standard. The quality system regulation, which is the 21 CFR 820, the current regulation that FDA has is very similar to ISO 13485. You know, there's minor changes, but we do recognize that that's very similar, and this is why we're also moving in the direction of modifying our regulations to be able to specifically call out ISO 13485. You know, we're moving in this direction because we see more opportunities to work closer with the regulatory authorities around the globe and facilitate regulatory convergence in quality management system, and the opportunities for medical device manufacturers to have a more globally harmonized quality management system. You know, this is why we see value, and this is why we're putting all the work in changing our regulations currently. And with that, I just again want to thank you for having me here and the opportunity to present to you. And so at this point, if I may, I you know, just want to call you know, Katie or Patty, if there's anything that you would like to add.
Please, I know this is Katie. Thank you so much. And nothing to add on my part. I think you covered everything very well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bessa. No, nothing to add. You did nicely.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. I guess, Sandra, we can open the floor and see if anybody has any questions. We're happy to answer.
Muchas gracias, Bessa. Me gusta.
I'd like to confirm with Oscar Marines if Oscar has any comments before we start generating questions. As a representative of the Ministry of Health. Thank you. As always, it's been a great experience to find out more about what you guys are doing. And in this sense, as many of the questions that I was going to ask you, the first question that I have is, how did you face the recognition of other authorities of sanitary barriers in other countries? How do you do? What are the challenges that you had when you were trying to get it recognized in other countries, and the type of that medical device requires in the US that has been recognized in other countries? That's the first question. And the second is regarding these IBPMs and the adaptation of ISO 13485 to the US. I would like if you could broaden a little bit what you said about what type of work you are doing when it started, about what we've seen. It's also a global direction towards this, and this is part of the project in different scope, but it's part of it's important for us to think about that, because it's part of what's going to be, we are going to be assessing us as regulatory agencies, because ISO is more a management system. Yes, there are some specific regulations apart regarding the implementation, right? I don't know if it's okay. Thank you, Oscar. Just a quick second so we can raise our Katie can help us with the answer. If you have question, is that okay? Could you
what I'm going to do is maybe tackle the second question, and I'm not so sure if so maybe if Katie understood it, she could answer, but we can also ask you some clarification questions. So just to clarify, you know, as I mentioned before, the quality system regulation that FDA currently has, and the way how, and we see that very similar to the clauses of ISO 13485. Although it's called as a management system, really the way how we are implementing the quality system regulation 45, there is requirements of design as well as manufacturing. So we're not just focusing on the documents that are needed to show the activities that the company is doing, but it's much more than that. They need to have procedures, they need to have processing in place, and making sure that those devices are manufactured as well as designed in a way that they can meet specification consistently. So it does focus on the total product life cycle. It's about being able to assess the changes, whether they impact safety and effectiveness, being able to have those decisions in there and be able for the company to make those, able to say, okay, we need to take these tests, we need to have these verification tests, we need to, where a change needs to another pre-market authorization, they need to be able to assess those. And there, we rely, you know, and we think that ISO 13485 does, you know, have all of those requirements within that system. So, so I just wanted to, you know, clarify that. So globally, you know, as I mentioned, MDSAP and you know, the single medical device single audit program, the model of how that's based is on ISO 13485, and actually it does build on risk. So there's a way to audit based on risk, the processes that are a higher risk. So, that is very specifically based on that. And this is how we rely on the auditors to be able to implement the standard and be able to audit to the standards as well. So there's a lot of work being done, but again, it very much is similar to the regulations that we've been using for a long time, and we have experience with, and this is why since they are very similar, we have confidence that going in this, or FDA has confidence that moving in this direction does have benefits or global convergence, but as well as we think that there's similar bar when it comes to regulating and auditing the requirements for the quality system. So I think that's what I wanted to say. And Katie, I don't know if you have anything to add. Oscar, I do apologize. I don't think I caught your first question, so maybe we need to repeat that. I'm not sure.
I was going to say, I'll jump in with just a couple of additional comments. I think on how Vesa answered number 2, and I'll take a stab at number 1, Oscar, and you can tell us if we answered your question or not. I think the only point that I would like to add to what Vesa said about, I really liked how she emphasized that by aligning our quality system to the international standard, the ISO 134, better have opportunities for collaboration with other regulatory through programs like MDSAP. And I think the reality, in particular to medical devices, world, no matter how big they are, will not be able to adequately regulate these products by themselves. There's just too many types of devices, too many companies offering these products. None of us are going to have the resources to be able to do inspections, to adequately the issues associated. But by aligning our regulatory systems to global standards and by collaborating with other regulators internationally, we have a better chance at being able to regulate them in a more targeted and more efficient way. And really, I think that was the key part of FDA deciding to align our quality system to the ISO 13485 standard. That said, it's not easy as a regulator to let go of your country's specific standards. And certainly in the case of FDA, that has not been an easy process. For those of us who grew up professionally using the ISO or using the quality system standard instead of ISO 13485, it's taken a lot of internal discussions, work internally to mapping the old system to the new system, a lot of emotion from our professionals, our regulatory professionals, about what this change looks like, what they're worried about losing in shifting over to this new system, et cetera. But I think the key point that we keep emphasizing with our review teams is that even though the systems may not be exactly aligned, we're gaining as an agency by being programs like MDSAP and collaborations with other regulators throughout the world, that it's worth having those conversations and it's worth moving forward. So that's what I would add to Vesa's point. I think what I understood with the first question was asking how FDA goes about using reliance mechanisms. And I'll be honest, I think whole-scale reliance is not something that our agency has a lot of experience with. That said, we do really work toward regulatory convergence projects. And I think a really great example in the medical device space is our engagement with the IMDRF, or the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, in developing standards that we really do try to apply internally, and through programs like the MDSAP. I think we actually do leverage the audits that are conducted by MDSAP. How we specifically manage them internally is we receive those reports and we have a reviewer, we have a regulatory professional on FDA side review those reports, decide whether they have any questions or whether they can make a decision based on the report itself. So there is still an ability for someone in our agency to use their judgment on how we move forward. But so I would say that we're taking steps toward reliance, but we're not actually full on relying, just because that is a very difficult concept, I think, for any regulatory authority. But I'm really encouraged that the development of standards that we can agree on internationally, and these with other regulators like those through MDSAP will help us move into that space more in the future. And please let us know if we did not understand your first question, because we'd be happy to.
Sí, gracias. No, nada más para abonar un poquito más a la primera pregunta que hiciste.
Just regarding the first question that
En la parte
regarding recognition, us, as you know, in the MDSAP, we try to do the auditing with auditing agencies. So what Katie said, that it was kind of complicated among agencies worked with the MDSAP to come up with a standard and say that the ISO 13485 would be the best way to do the audit, and that all quality systems that encompassed all this in the design, the manufacturing, and the disposition allowed us to have a complete inspection of everything that had to do with the manufacture of medical device. Once we had come to this agreement in this standard, the idea was to how can we be sure that the auditing agencies will comply with the auditing model, how they are going to be doing the standardized auditing, and depending on the auditing company that are going to do the inspection, if it's the same auditing company and they are going to receive the same criteria, that they're going to receive the same feedback during the inspection. It took us a long time, a lot of work, and that's why the auditing organizations, they are still in the of working of us to work in this program.
Dijo Katie, aún a pesar de todo eso, cada una de las autoridades.
Besides all of that, the regulating agencies, the authorities have the authority of saying, well, I'm going to review this report, and if there's anything as an authority, I have any doubts, I have the prerogative of inspecting or request for more information. So I don't know if it helped you with what you asked about how do you take that first step of understanding what has happened, but as regulators, the truth, the responsibility that we have is huge, and suddenly having that kind of actions is difficult. And in a way, by working in a standardized way, in collaboration, the end result, which is the protection to the health of our population, reaches the same levels in these programs by in comparison to when we do it by ourselves. And with your answers, it got very clear for me. Thank you for answering my question. So thank you. See any question in the Q&A? So I would like to ask a last question. I know we are ahead of our time already, but we are going to continue a little bit longer and we are going to conclude right away. So if the FDA at some point has had the idea of evaluating the inconvenience and of maintaining its regulatory scheme covering all the medical device, including the IVD reagents. So did they choose to have a different regulation group of medical devices?
I guess I'll
Go ahead, Vesa.
I'll give it a go, and then Katie maybe can supplement. But as I mentioned, the medical device law, it came in 1976. This is when the medical devices started to be regulated by the FDA. It was then set forth that the definition of a medical device that I mentioned, which included also in vitro diagnostics. You bring up a good question because it's been so long ago. We don't have that particular information at the time. As far as what FDA did to evaluate in 1976 and whether they considered diagnostics and other medical devices to be regulated differently. What I do know is that the way how FDA has been regulating since 1976 has been working, and we haven't had any problems in calling or needing something different. And so just from the experience that we've had, I wanted to share that. But although we don't have the specifics of what was considered back, so many years ago. I don't know if Katie has anything to add to that.
I think the only thing I'll add, and I'll say this as someone, my previous job, I actually worked but in the area of in vitro diagnostics. I was the deputy director for the chemistry and toxicology branch or division. And I think one of the things that we did occasionally hear from stakeholders who wondered if FDA should be regulating IVDs separately from medical devices. And I really think that the system was so well designed in 1976, imperfect as every law is, but it was so well designed to accommodate different types of products on how those products are used and what they're intended for. So as Vesa really described well, focusing in on the intended use of that product and thinking through the risk benefit of that intended use, allowing us to classify it based on risk and regulate it based on risk, with IVDs thinking about that risk being an unintended false result. So I don't think that we've encountered, in my experience in vitro diagnostic regulation, we experienced challenges in operating within the medical device framework. In fact, I think we found the framework to be very flexible and very appropriate for the devices that we regulated.
Muchas gracias, Katie. Muchas gracias, Besa. Pues ahora sí que muchas
gracias. Katie y Besa. Thank you for allowing us to go ahead of our time a little bit. So we thank you for your participation. I would like to ask Oscar and Dr. Ayala to share some brief comments to conclude this meeting. So for the participation from the FDA, these spaces are always very enriching. We have a hard work ahead of us, so we really expect to be able to count on your support as well as the support of the USAID. And this is some work that we're going to start, and we know we have a huge task ahead of us. And by being able to make use of the huge experience of these entities, this is the best scenario, all the things we have to work with. So the challenge of the ministry is to have the best regulation and the most efficient one to allow an impact in the health of the patients. This is the health that we have in the ministry, and obviously, you know, and the industry knows that the country where you have a standard for medical device needs this capacity. So we have to involve the countries that sell it to us, the ones we sell to, and we have to have the industry together. So we need this best evaluation to make sure the decrees are adequate and good enough, and if we effectively can change it, to have all the tools to say we are doing our job well, we are making an impact in the health of our patients. Expect at the end of the exposed evaluation, after discussing this decrease for 15 years, there are things that we did well and some things that we may be able to correct. So this is the work that is the best scenario possible, having a good work to say we were able to help with the health of the country. Thank you, Oscar. Dr. Ayala, any other final comment? Thank you, Sandra Ligia. I would agree with Oscar, with the Ministry of Health, in terms of thanking, especially FDA, for accepting our invitation and share with us their valuable experience. For Colombia, FDA is a sanitary authority by which we go to when we consider our own laws, and we feel very glad, and we know this project is advancing together with our weekly meetings, and we are learning more, and so we can really collaborate with the health, the public health, the population. This is something we really aim at, and we are very committed and willing to do so in order to participate productively in this project. Thank you. Thank you, Lucia. And open space for the final comment from the FDA group. I'm going to do it in English to make it easier. Sorry for the ones that speak Spanish. So it would be for Katie.
Of the FDA CDRH Standards and Conformity Assessment Program and its role in supporting FDA's efforts in global regulatory convergence?
Sure. So I guess we do have as mentioned in that the comment, we do have a good standards and conformity assessment program, and I think it's a really critical program for us. As Vesa mentioned, these standards allow us to better interact with both industry as well as the other regulators in the world on the standards and expectations that we have for the different products. Both from a technical level as well as from a quality system level, et cetera. And I think based on those standards, we are able to be a much more efficient and nimble regulatory agency. And I guess Patty or Vesa, if you have anything to add, I would be very, very happy to hear from you as well.
That was, I think you covered it excellently.
Entonces me parece que con este
So
comentario
it seems that with this final comment, we have all the space now to invite you to share how you manage to operate and the benefits you have seen from this new direction, and how in this process of development and update of the legislation in Colombia, you could get some benefit by knowing more and analyzing the pertinence in the alternative FDA has taken. So it seems concluded this part of translation. So we are, as a working group, offering and defining these opportunities of collaboration. We thank you for your support so we can go further in the development of competences and more knowledge. And at the end, we have a benefit of being able to have access, more efficient access and timely access to the medical technology to the population with the level of safety it is mandatory. With that, we conclude the session. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.